Have you ever watched a group of 5-year-old boys play soccer? It's pretty cute. They move around the field in this little swarm until suddenly one of them breaks free with the ball, dribbles down to the goal, shoots, and scores. In that moment, he knows that he is the best, the all-star of the team, the hero. Give this kid 3 to 4 more years playing soccer. If he continues to play with this strategy, he'll find that it no longer works. Soon the other players are learning to pass, they're learning positions, they're learning defense, and he can no longer succeed with his breakaway, be the team all-star strategy. If he wants to succeed, he needs to learn to pass, to communicate, and to work with his team. He has to be a team player. I view the United States the same way I view this soccer player. We can think that we're the best, the superstar player who dribbles ahead of everyone else, but it's never going to work if we're so consumed with ourselves that we don't learn to pass, to communicate, and to work with others. If we truly want to be a great nation, we have to be a team player. With that, Ben's topic for today, nationalism.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Ramble, a series of videos about the upcoming election and why it makes moral and economic sense to vote for Joe Biden. Today I want to talk about nationalism. And I think it's important to start out by trying to clearly define nationalism and patriotism, because of course those two concepts are very closely linked to each other. In my view, patriotism is defending and working for your nation, and especially what your nation stands for. Nationalism is very similar. It's identifying with your nation and supporting its interests, but it especially to the detriment of other nations and their interests. So, like I said, the two are very closely linked, but I view nationalism as basically an extreme form of patriotism. And importantly, and I'll come back to this over and over in the video, at its center, nationalism is a divisive concept. And to kind of drive that distinction home, for me, when I think about patriotic people, I think about my grandparents who fought in World War II, and that whole generation. They were very, very, I think, patriotic generation. And, if you think about it, though, what they were doing is they were fighting against nationalism. They were fighting against this idea that Hitler had and the Nazi movement had of creating a nation that was better than everyone else in some sense. And they were fighting against that very idea. And I think this sort of, for me, helps me distinguish that patriotism and nationalism are not necessarily the same thing. Now, there's also a third concept that I want to talk about briefly, which is American exceptionalism. It's very closely related to patriotism and nationalism. This is why I think it's worthwhile to take a minute and think about whether you think America is exceptional, and if so, why? What makes us exceptional? For me, America is exceptional, but it's not because Americans are better than other people intrinsically, but instead, the United States is an exceptional bundle of ideals that we're working towards and that we have fought for in the past. And these ideals for me are hard work and opportunity, generosity, forgiveness, inclusivity, being a mixing pot, having an entrepreneurial spirit. This is what makes America a truly great nation. Now, I think it's important to note that we have not always fully lived up to those ideals. We certainly have some terrible blemishes on our record. But the most patriotic thing we can do is work towards those and find ways to live up to what we would like to become. If I ask myself, is Trump making America exceptional in the way that I want us to be exceptional? I have to answer no. Instead, Trump has this sort of nationalistic, us against them, divisive mentality that undermines almost everything that I think the United States should stand for. And if I'm going to be patriotic, I need to push against that. And that's really a lot of why I'm making this whole series of videos, is because I feel so strongly about that. So nationalism at its core is divisive and does not make America exceptional. Now, the reason why I feel so strongly about this is because so many issues that the United States faces today are actually global issues, and they require collective action from the whole world. These are things like climate change or stopping coronavirus, which we've seen over the last several months, requires collective action from everyone. Or you can also think about making sure that we are protected against the rise of other countries that maybe don't value freedom as much or don't have those same ideals. That's going to take collective action as well. It can't just be the United States standing on its own. And let me give a couple of examples of divisive things and nationalistic things that Trump has done during his presidency. Shortly after he was elected, one of the first things he did was pull out of the Paris Climate Accords. Now, these climate accords were a series of agreements between a bunch of countries around the world to reduce carbon emissions to slow down climate change. And basically, Trump, sort of when he came into office, cited that he basically said that that the deal was unfair to the United States. And because it was unfair, he was going to pull out of the deal. I think it's really important to recognize that the climate accords were completely voluntary. Trump was free to renegotiate any part of the deal that the US had made if he had wanted to. But instead, Trump's mentality is always us against them, and he essentially just took his ball and went home. He said, it's unfair, so I'm out, and that's it. There was no work to find common ground. There was no work to unify and work towards this large goal of reducing climate change, which is potentially one of the most important issues we'll face over the next 50 or 100 years. A second example of what Trump has done is he has sort of consistently fought against our allies in NATO. He's insulted these other countries that are part of this alliance. So what NATO is it's this group of countries that was formed shortly after World War II that was designed to hopefully prevent any future world wars from happening, to prevent any one country from rising up and imposing its will or its culture on other countries. Pretty much repeatedly throughout his presidency, Trump has insulted other countries with whom we are allied. And one of the main claims he has made is that they are not paying their fair share as part of being in NATO. Now, I think it's really important to recognize here that the United States has chosen to spend more on military than these other countries. And that was our choice, and it was not necessarily something that was part of the agreement with NATO. And in fact, in 2014, the other countries in NATO actually agreed to start increasing their military spending to reach a goal of each country spending at least 2% of its GDP on the military by 2024. And since that time, I think 8 countries have reached that goal, and many others are working towards it, and they still have 4 more years to get there. Meanwhile, over the last 4 years, Trump has been consistently calling out these countries for not paying their fair share, when in fact they have agreed to increase their spending, and they're working towards it. And you can imagine how they would feel if the leader of the United States is consistently calling them out for not paying their fair share when they have agreed to increase and they're working towards that goal. It's going to undermine this alliance. So at its core, if you really boil it down, Trump's rhetoric is always divisive. And I think it's because Trump sees the world as a zero-sum game. Basically, in his view, if you win, we lose. And if I win, then you lose. But really, that's not what you want a president to do. Almost everything a president needs to work towards has to be finding a win-win. Has to be finding common ground and making progress in a unified way rather than in a divisive way. I think we really need to recognize that if our allies win, then we win. If we all work together, then we all win. But instead, Trump kind of wants to alienate other nations and alienate almost anyone who doesn't look or think like him. The reason why this really undermines the United States is because when we have this us against them mentality, it actually vacates power for other countries. To go back to one example that I gave before, with the Paris Climate Accords, when the United States pulled out, that essentially left China in the driver's seat of those accords. They were the next biggest nation. And so without the United States there, they had a lot of say over how those climate talks proceeded after that. And so really, by pulling out and refusing to work with other countries, he left the door open for China to have a bigger seat at the table. And in general, this is just what happens when you break up alliances it leaves the United States on its own, and those other alliances can then consolidate power, and it diminishes the type of power that the United States, I think, can have throughout the world. I've heard people say they love Trump because he's willing to call out China, for example, for being unfair, and he's like very open and brash about the way that he does that. And it's true, he is very open and brash. But I think the real problem is Trump isn't anti-China, he's anti-everyone else. And he kind of does this without compunction, without really even thinking about it. He is constantly dividing, constantly fighting battles against other people rather than finding ways to unite. Lastly, I think it's really important that I address how Trump's divisive nature and divisive rhetoric is dividing our country from within as well as without. I think that's kind of the best place for me to talk about that. So far throughout the video, I've been talking about how nationalism divides the United States from other nations. But I think in recent months, we've really seen the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and protests around the country, that there are huge and important divisions within our country as well. Now, whatever you feel about the Black Lives Matter movement and the direction that it's headed, I think we have to recognize that there's a large group of people within our country who feel disenfranchised, who feel like they don't have a part of the American dream. And I think we also have to recognize that feeling has gotten worse over the last 4 years. Now, Trump did not cause racism in the United States, and if we elect Joe Biden, it's not going to end racism in the United States either. But Trump himself repeatedly makes overtly racist and xenophobic comments and tweets. He does it from the Rose Garden and in media, press conferences. He's very open about it. And not only that, but I think Trump emboldens other people who might feel even more strongly than he does, people who are clearly white supremacists. This is simply not acceptable for our country, and it's not the direction that I want to go. And so I think this is just another example of how Trump's us against them mentality is dividing our country from within in the same way that his nationalism divides our country from without. And this is why I think the most patriotic thing we can do is to fight against that and not vote him back into office.